Welcome, everybody, to this New Year's edition of the IFS Zooms In. And I'm delighted this week to be joined by Professor Sir Angus Deaton, who is with us at the IFS running a very big multi-year review looking at inequalities and where we are with inequalities, not just in income, but in health, wealth, education, and all sorts of other dimensions of inequality, and with whom we'll be writing over the next couple of years some very big outputs, looking, we hope, at some of the solutions to some of the more problematic inequalities that we face. But in the last couple of weeks, Angus and some of us at the IFS have been writing some things about what's been happening recently, both to inequality in the United States and also to the more recent impact of COVID over here in the UK. And Angus, in your most recent piece on what's been happening in the US, you've got some very striking concerns about the role of big companies, the role of big pharma, big tech companies, as well as concerns about the US health system, which of course is very different to that here, and the big gaps between those with and without university degrees. A whole series of major concerns in the way that you write about the level of inequality in the US. But it's not something that certainly over on this side of the Atlantic has been very present in the discussion of what's been happening in Washington. We've just had the mob, as it were, storming the Capitol. We've had a very divided election. We've still got, you've still got the pandemic over there, just as we have it over here. To what extent do you think inequalities are part of what's been driving the extraordinary politics that we've seen over in the US recently?
Well, I think you have to be careful about the sort of simplistic and deterministic arguments that, these people are rioting because of inequality or they're rioting because of the pandemic. But we've got this sort of unholy stew, which has many, many parts in it. And it has struck me with some surprise that the reporting of the events in the Capitol and the so-called transfer, or we hope eventually peaceful transfer of power, has been taken as a completely separate event from the pandemic. And I think the level of unhappiness, the level of tension, which, in a longer term, you can trace back to a lot of different inequalities, which I think are messing us about, has been greatly heightened by the fact that people's lives are at risk, and also by the politicization of that. So you've created this divide between people who believe this virus is sort of a hoax. It's a pretty amazing thing to believe at this stage, and those who are terrified of it. And that has broken along political lines too, which is quite extraordinary, but not unprecedented. I was looking the other day, in 1900, when the U.S. was already the richest country in the world, and where there'd been a vaccine for smallpox for more than 100 years, the U.S. had higher smallpox death rates than any other rich country in the world. So we've sort of been here before.
That's extraordinary. And as you say, I mean, we see it a little bit here as well. The political the correlation between people's politics and their views on all sorts of things has been growing stronger, hasn't it, in the US over the last 20 or 30 years? The more that once you know someone's view on one thing, you're more likely to have a pretty good grasp of where they are on other bits of political spectrum.
Yes, that seems to be the case, and it's the loss of any sense of socially accepted truth by the majority of the population seems like a really, really serious loss, and I don't know where we go from this. I mean, you started out talking about, something that is probably receded into the background a little bit, which is the need to think seriously about what big companies are doing to us and handling the tech giants and all the rest of it. It's clear that in the last few days here, they have begun to realize that they may have been riding a tiger through their enormous political contributions, and that this has helped contribute to the crisis that we have right now. Often you get these corporate giants who talk a good line, but they don't do very much. But this time they're really threatening to cut off campaign financing, and that, if it's systematically carried through, would make a large difference.
And that's very different, I think, from what we see in the UK. One of the things that really struck me reading your piece of a week or so ago about inequality in the US was how actually a lot of it didn't ring terribly true in the UK. I mean, we don't have quite the epidemic of deaths from opioid abuse that you refer to in the US. We don't have this terrible health divide in access to health that you have in the US. But also, I don't think we have this enormous power of big tech and big pharma over politics. But maybe I'm being a little naive on that. I mean, do you think this is a particularly US phenomenon?
That's a really good question, and I wish I knew the answer to that. But I think you should beware. I think that's sort of the answer to that. That a lot of what happens here makes its way across the Atlantic sooner or later. The drug epidemic here now is largely an illegal one, so it's no longer being fueled by the medical system. And so you face that problem in exactly the same way that we do. And the numbers in Britain are still much lower than America, except perhaps in Scotland, where there's really very serious drug epidemic going on. And so I think it really could happen to you in terms of the deaths from opioids. We unfortunately don't know in Britain what the educational divide of mortality is because the data are not collected. And that's, I think, a major lacuna in the statistical system in the UK. It would be really nice to know what's happening along that particular divide. As to big tech, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that there's a lot more lobbying goes on in Brussels than seems to go on in London because it's the EU that is the primary front for these discussions of, antitrust law and all the rest of it. And that gets a lot of publicity. But you've just left the EU. And I would have thought that those companies are going to decamp, those lobbying groups are going to decamp to London. And I actually, reading the British press, and you would know better than I on this, that there was a real sense coming out of Downing Street that one of the reasons for getting out of Brexit was to give the government its opportunity to play special favors and do nice things for favored companies in Britain. Is that not true? If it is true, it's a real worry.
I'm not quite sure that's how they would put it, but I think there is a there is a desire. I think you're right. There is a desire to free the government up to, as they would see it, provide help for British champions or to provide subsidies to get companies to invest in particular areas or to do more to bring in foreign investment under rules that are difficult to do within the European Union. And actually having worked within government, it is something that worries me, I have to say, because not having any external constraint on that behaviour does make a whole series of individual decisions, which can look politically desirable because you can see there might be votes in them or indeed campaign finance in them, each one difficult to avoid. And the consequences in total could be, as you've seen in the US, quite dramatic. But you've mentioned, I don't think we can move off this without saying a little bit more about your work on what you call deaths of despair, which not all of the listeners will necessarily be aware of. And you mentioned just now this extraordinary pharmaceutical company inspired or created problem of deaths from opioid abuse in the US. So perhaps you could just say a little bit about what that is, because I think it will come as a shock to a number of people, quite what's been happening.
Yeah, this is what my book with Anne Case, which is called Deaths of Despair and Future Capitalism, is about. About 5 years ago, maybe a little more, we discovered that among people in middle age, there really was quite a rapid rise in deaths that shouldn't be taking place. So that overall, life expectancy, which has been rising for 100 years, reached its peak in 2014, and it actually has not reached that level again. And you have something similar in Britain in that life expectancy growth, which has been pretty reliable, has stalled for a bunch of years. It's not actually going down. And in the last year, in 2019, it actually had a welcome upward tick, the highest upward tick since about 2010, I think. But there's nothing like that happening here. And you've got this situation in which large numbers of people are dying, about 160,000 a year, from suicides, from drug overdoses, and from alcoholic liver diseases, which are all forms of sort of self-destruction in one way or another. And those numbers fell a little bit a couple of years ago. They came back again last year, and the drug epidemic seems to be picking up even more rapidly since the middle of last year and continuing into the pandemic. And what's happening is all these deaths are among people who don't have a college degree. Here, it takes 4 years to get a college degree, to get a bachelor's degree. And about a third of the population currently have a bachelor's degree and 2/3 do not. And once you get a bachelor's degree, you're pretty much exempt from these deaths of despair. And of course, what's bothering us is during the pandemic, these divisions are getting even worse because the BA people, the educated people, are much more likely to sit at home, to be able to work from home without interruptions of their salaries and without any risk to their lives. Whereas a lot of the people without BA are in service industries, they're working on the front lines, they might be working in meatpacking and transportation, in a lot of, and in the health sector, in fact. And so these low salary people are either lost their jobs or they kept their jobs at the risk of their lives. And so these divisions we've been writing about, like many other things with COVID, have been terribly widened. And so that worries us that when eventually COVID goes away, as we hope, in a year or so it will, then we'll be left with, even wider gaps than the gaps that were already there that we've been writing about.
And I think those COVID-related divisions are something we really worry about here as well. I mean, we've seen deaths from COVID being at least as socially graded as deaths were before. And we know that anyway, people from poorer backgrounds are much less likely to live long lives than those who are better off and better educated. And we've seen that again with COVID. And again, we've seen who are the people in the UK least likely to be able to work from home. They're the lowest paid and in general the lowest educated. And it's again completely graded from the lowest earning tenth of the population to the highest earning tenth. As you move up that scale, you get more and more bigger and bigger fraction who are able to work at home. And the difference between the top and the bottom is really very high. We've also seen, as you'd expect, the job losses and the furlough much higher among people from lower income, lower earning backgrounds. I don't think we've quite seen the divergence between those with and without college degrees, university degrees that you've seen in the US. Clearly, those with higher education in the UK earn more than those with lower education, and they have often a lot of the other things that go with higher earning jobs, more in the way of job security and benefits associated with that. But you've also traced these big differences in things like health, marriage, social interaction, and all sorts of other important elements of living a good life, where I think your work has suggested that gap didn't exist to a huge extent 40, 50 years ago, but now is the biggest dividing line in American society?
Well, I think it reasonably could be thought of that way. There's one thing you haven't mentioned, which is a huge issue here for all dividing lines, which is race. And obviously the racial issues in the US are different from what they are in Britain. It's not like you don't have them, but they work in different dimensions. And, before all the chaos that's happened last week at the election, we had a summer of racial unrest, a very serious racial unrest in the US. And that cross-cuts with these issues of health and so on. I mean, African Americans have always had lower life expectancy than whites. And they're suffering particularly badly during the pandemic. That we know. We don't know so much about the income or educational basis of people who are dying during the pandemic, but we will find that out as we go. I'm not sure. I mean, let me make two comparisons with the UK, which I think are important here. One is that Britain is still a sort of gentler place than America is. It might be an odd word to use over recent years, but you still have a fairly elaborate and well-developed social safety system so that, as you and your colleagues have written about, even though people at the bottom are doing relatively worse in the labor market, people at the top doing much better, the benefit system and tax system untangles that to some degree. So you don't, and there's none of that here. So if you're doing badly in the labor market, you're doing badly, full stop. I still just come back to this thing about education. You don't really have the data which allow us to grade deaths by education. And that would be something that would be very interesting to see. I mean, the data you refer to, which I know are basically looking across more deprived and less deprived areas. And that's a very useful way to go, but it doesn't get us at what's happening to individuals in the same way that if you can look at their death certificates and know a lot more about them.
Yeah, there's so much in what you say there. I mean, as you say, the race or ethnic differences are very different between the UK and the US. But again, one of the striking aspects of this pandemic, at least of the first wave of it, I don't know if we've got data from the most recent wave, was very different rates of mortality among those from different ethnic backgrounds in the UK, partly or significantly reflecting the different sorts of roles that they play in society. So a lot of Black African men, a lot of Black women work in social care and the health service, very high fractions actually. A lot of Pakistani and Bangladeshi men work in self-employed, maybe working in driving taxis and buses and so on. And these are risky occupations, and we've seen very high levels of death rates among some of those very particular ethnic groups. And maybe this is something that, as we come out of this, we will begin to recognise the contribution that some of these groups make to these vital services, and indeed the importance of some of these vital services. I don't know whether we'll see changes as we as we come out of this. But you've also, you've also kind of picked up the very important role of and different role of the welfare state. And I suppose it's a genuine. It's a genuine curiosity, I think, to those of us sitting in the UK who have never lived in the US, I mean, how a society works where there isn't a real safety net. I mean, whether that be a safety net in terms of income if you become unemployed, but also in the health system where there isn't a proper safety net in the health system. And I mean, genuinely, it's hard, I think, for us to quite conceive how that works.
Well, it doesn't work very well, is the answer. I mean, I think, one of the reasons we don't have it is not that people don't want it. We're not that different from Europeans and other countries that have much better systems. Once again, a lot of it comes back to race. And there's always been this feeling in the US, whenever we move towards a deeper welfare state, that whites don't want to give benefits for blacks. And, in the discussions around the time when the National Health Service was formed in Britain, usually after the Second World War, similar discussions went on here. And in the end, they were broken by who were then Southern Democrats. They would now be Southern Republicans, but representatives from the South who just would not go along with this. And even the Social Security that we had, the pension system, for instance, that was designed to exclude most black workers, not by name, but by excluding certain occupations, agriculture, for instance, in which blacks were heavily represented. I think, coming back to the COVID and race, though, I find the British data very interesting, and I wish I knew what the baseline death rates were, which unfortunately we don't really know. And the story about occupations is a little odd because it obviously happens here too. But, for instance, women are very much more heavily in occupations, in health occupations, in occupations at risk of the things you were just talking about. And we see no elevation in their death rates here at all. And they're completely parallel death rates between men and women for COVID. I mean, women die at lower rates than men. But the fluctuations over this epidemic have been remarkably similar. And my feeling is that you don't see very much in the UK either, but I haven't looked at those data very carefully.
Not by gender, you're right, but very definitely by ethnic background, which appears to be related to occupation, at least to some degree.
Yeah.
Again, I mean, your description of some of the scale of these issues in the US, I mean, it remains quite shocking, even to a society like the UK, which is relatively unequal by European standards. But coming back to the politics of this, you've written about the extent to which the incoming president, Joe Biden, has a set of advisors, including economic advisors, who are really quite focused on some of these issues around inequality. Is it your sense that this is a set of issues where we'll get significant action over the next few years? Is this something that incoming President Biden is really driven by, or and indeed, are there things that one could do over a 4-year presidential term that would make a big difference?
Yes, I mean, I think so. And I think the commitment here is genuine. Biden is perhaps the last of, or his traces of the old Democratic politicians who came out of the unions and were supported by the white working class as well as by African Americans. So he has that advantage. And there's no doubt at all that people like Janet Yellen or Chad Bernstein and my boss, actually, C.C. Rose, are very deeply committed to these issues. So, and I've changed my tune a little bit on this. I mean, for some time I've been saying these big issues are not really very amenable to a change of whose hands are on the steering wheel sort of idea. But given the incredibly horrible things that have gone on under Donald Trump, I come to believe that, getting rid of Donald Trump is more than cosmetic. It really will just make a huge difference not to have that torrent of lies and racial stoking and white supremacy sort of coming out of the White House. So that, I think, will make an enormous difference. There are, of course, great difficulties in handling these issues. I mean, the Democratic Party is nowadays an alliance between educated professionals on the one hand and minorities on the other. The white working class that used to be the backbone of the Democratic Party no longer really supports them in significant numbers and has gone over to the other side. So that if the crucial inequality divide is between working class people or less educated people and this educated elite, then the Democratic Party is not always in the best position to really do something about that or have people who really care about it. So that, for instance, Hillary Clinton was certainly seen as the antithesis by the people who voted for Donald Trump, many of whom were less educated whites. And I don't think they're going to be very enthusiastic about Joe Biden either. The ones of them that haven't retreated into a fantasy world of conspiracy theories and goodness knows all what else. So it's a very volatile and very difficult situation. We've no idea what will happen to the Republican Party as a result of what's happened in the last few weeks.
And I guess there are certainly some parallels there with what we've seen in the UK over the last couple of decades, where we've certainly seen a serious movement away from the class basis of political voting, with working class voters now no more likely to be voting Labour than Conservative, and to some degree actually more likely to be voting Conservative. I suppose there's an interesting question for us as to whether that will change the politics of the Conservative Party, which came in promising this rather unclear thing called levelling up, an idea to get the poorer regions, and particularly the north, doing better relative to London and the south, but with frankly nothing approaching a clear plan for how to do it. And indeed, I don't think anything approaching a clear appreciation of the scale of what they might want to achieve, particularly if they're really looking at making a big difference to the relativities between local areas. It's interesting here, actually, that the pandemic has, if anything, had a bigger effect in some of the better off areas than elsewhere, economically at least. The biggest job losses have been in London as a fraction of the workforce, because such a large fraction of the London workforce is involved in tourism, entertainment, retail, hospitality, and so on. And I think people forget that actually there's a very big, very low-paid workforce in London, and that most inequality is within regions rather than between.
Absolutely. And the same, I think, is happening here. I mean, the pandemic, of course, came along the trade routes in the first place. So you've got places like New York and New Jersey, which were very badly hit in the first wave. And that's been less so, and it's spreading elsewhere. But it's certainly true that, the most inequality is within places, not between places. And that's always a bit of a problem if you chart it by looking across areas rather than looking across individuals somehow.
And certainly, again, the big divide here is associated very directly with education. If you look at average earnings in different areas, you can explain a very large fraction of the differences by looking at education levels in those areas. If you transplant a highly qualified graduate from one area to another, they will tend to keep a large fraction of their salary. So there's big issues there. And one of the things that I think worries some of us, particularly about the pandemic, is the impact on education. We're in the UK now 1 week into the third lockdown, but the second time that schools have effectively completely closed. We know that first time round it was children from poorer backgrounds who got the worst deal. They were much less likely to get online teaching. They were often not able to access the internet or have a good place to work. And we know there's a huge divide between the public and private sector, state schools and private schools, in the kinds of support that was offered. And we know, of course, that we went into this with big social divides in terms of the fractions of children from different backgrounds achieving at the levels required to get them on into successful jobs. I presume you've seen something similar in the US, but I've not seen any analysis of that.
I haven't looked at the formal analysis either, but I'm sure it's the case. And we know that exactly what you said is happening here too, that kids, who don't have internet access, or kids who live in households where the parents are trying to hold down 2 or 3 jobs and may not be very interested in their kids' education, so that they're not prepared to supervise them or even able to get them connected up. There's stories of mothers taking their kids to hotel rooms. If you know what it's like, we've all had this experience of sitting in a hotel room with the slowest internet you've ever seen in the world. if you can imagine kids trying to do that. But this worries me enormously. And I think this is perhaps the most obvious place where the scars are going to be really permanent. Because all of our evidence suggests that if you have interruptions to schooling at crucial stages, you missed the day in which they did multiplication or something, then that stays with you the rest of your life, and you really miss out forever. And I don't know whether we'll be able to repair some of that ex post, once the pandemic's over. And certainly it does prioritize investments in internet technology, making sure that becomes a basic service like water supply or something of the sort that everybody has. But it's also a problem for people entering the labor market for the first time, I think. And there's quite a lot of evidence that if you come into the labor market in a bad time, then your wages are permanently depressed and may never really catch up. And we certainly see that close to home with looking at the PhD students graduating from Princeton this year who are looking for jobs. I mean, their estimate seems to be that about only 1/6 of the number of jobs for next year that there would be in a normal year. And so who knows what those people are going to do.
I guess that's a very particular example of a much bigger issue. I mean, I suppose I'm quite concerned about the impact on generational inequalities that this pandemic is going to potentially exacerbate. I mean, clearly, those children at school who are not getting as much education as they should be is one issue. But I think more generally, with the extremely, we've got two or three aspects of this. I think also, as you say, those entering the labour market are really struggling. We know that younger people who are much more likely to be working in the sort of hospitality and similar sectors are much more likely to have lost their jobs than older workers. But we've also seen this huge increase in quantitative easing, in interest rates taken down to essentially zero, and therefore a support of asset prices, effectively, which in the end is on average beneficial for the older and wealthier generation than for the younger, and certainly in the UK makes getting onto the housing ladder potentially even more difficult. And I think if there's one sort of macro mistake that the British government's made after 2010, it was to have fiscal policy which moved in the same direction as monetary policy. In other words, monetary policy was clearly favouring those who already had assets, and fiscal policy did the same by protecting the older generation, and austerity really hit the younger generation harder. And I think one of the things we really ought to be looking to is fiscal policy over the next several years that leans against that effect rather than leans in the same direction.
We're very envious of you being able to do fiscal policy at all as part of the issue. If you can imagine the Congress here, where rioters are threatening to hang the vice president and they're hiding under their desks, is only the most extreme case of a legislature, which was the idea that it would pass sensible fiscal policy under the divisions that we have right now. So we've had this dominance of monetary policy because the Fed has been untrammeled by those sort of disasters. So some of the politicians would really like to rein the Fed in and stop giving it that power on the grounds that it's non-democratic, which is in some sense true. And so I think that's really been a problem. But one thing we have that you don't have to anything like the same extent is the stock market. So our stock market at the end of the year, the Dow was over 31,000, which is way ahead. It's about more than 10% higher than it was on the eve of the pandemic. So what the pandemic has done is elevated the stock market. Now, sure, there are very low interest rates, zero interest rates, all the rest of it. And where else are people going to make their money? But there's something else going on here. And what's going on here, of course, is that big tech, has become enormously more valuable. And what's driving that stock market rally is largely the shares of the big tech companies. But it's meant the things we've been talking about, people like us sitting at home or talking to each other on Zoom and so on, many of us who now have defined contribution pension schemes are getting rich in ways that we'd never imagined would be possible, because our pensions, the amount we have in our pension funds, has gone through the roof. And of course, at the very top, the estimates are the sort of 10 richest people in the world have made an extra $1 trillion during this pandemic. Jeff Bezos himself has made about another 80 billion on top of the more than 100 billion he had to start with. I mean, these themes seemed unimaginable as levels, and now these are extra. So there's this extraordinary explosion of wealth, not just at the very top, but among this educated elite who, have defined contribution pension schemes.
So if you happen to be owning assets when this started, then you've done very well indeed. I mean, that's something we've seen here over a period of time. It's I suppose equivalent to or similar to period back from 2008. If you happen to be a homeowner in 2008, you've done really very well over the last decade. If you happen not to be, then you've found it much harder to get into the housing market. Indeed, we've had something like a halving the fraction of young people who are homeowners compared with 25 years ago. What you're talking about, of course, is even more dramatic at the top of the distribution. And you're also talking about this kind of increased wealth and potentially power of this of the big tech companies. Do you worry that one of the things that this pandemic may have done is to lead to, or perhaps accelerate, a world in which we move toward, we have more market power for a very small number of companies, and we lose some of the benefits of some of the competition on which a successful democratic or capitalist society is built? I mean, is this going to hasten a return to the period of 120 years ago when monopolies were able to be incredibly powerful?
I think it will certainly provoke a reckoning of that. And that just in the last few days, after all, I mean, when Twitter and Facebook and Amazon basically took away Donald Trump's voice and took away the platform on which the rebellion was based, people like me are, and people who read the quality newspapers, people are delighted that that's happened. But on the other hand, they're made incredibly uncomfortable by the power of those giants to silence the President of the United States and other people that they want to be able to silence. And I think the view from Europe, which has been, I think, singularly misinformed. I mean, it was Angela Merkel was saying yesterday that, what America needs is for the government to control hate speech. The First Amendment to our Constitution prevents the government from controlling hate speech. So the hate speech laws you have in Europe would be immediately struck down here as unconstitutional, which is very odd because then Twitter and Amazon and Facebook have the ability to police hate speech, which the state does not have at all. So those issues are even, and of course there were enormous issues before that of the amount of information that those companies have. They're giving us wonderful services in many cases for very little money, but it seems like we're paying a very large price for that. And that reckoning is certainly going to happen. And what's happened here in the last few days will certainly accelerate that reckoning, because people on the left and right are both incredibly upset about the power of those companies to do what they've done.
What might a reckoning look like?
Well, I think it's very unpredictable. I mean, I think, what happens may be sensible, it may not be sensible. And that's where it's probably important that we have Joe Biden and a bunch of relatively sensible people, or sensible people, not even relatively sensible people, in Washington, as opposed to a bunch of grifters who are stealing stuff and just enriching themselves and their cronies. Having people in charge of that discussion will make a tremendous difference, but it's very unclear what is going to happen. And you gave the example of the trusts in, more than 100 years ago. And, and that gave rise to really positive things. So that there was a real attempt by the government and the people to rein in inequality in various ways. So that, for instance, the regressive movement, they actually got 4 amendments to the Constitution in the early years of the 20th century, all of which were aimed at reducing inequality. The most infamous of those was prohibition, which banned alcohol. But alcohol was seen as an inequality issue. It was seen as something that gave enormous power to men over women. And it was the strongest supporters of prohibition were the various women groups who wanted out from under this yoke. But the Federal Reserve was established, the income tax was established, and those required not just laws, but changes to the Constitution, and those were actually carried out. There were electoral reforms too. The senators used to be appointed not by election at all, but by state legislatures, who were owned by local businesses and interests. And that required a constitutional change too. So the beginning of the 20th century is certainly an example of something that can happen, that you can get people so upset and so feeling that there's need for reform and they're being abused, that they did relatively sensible things. Prohibition turned out not to be a very good idea. But imagine the U.S. without a Federal Reserve today or without an income tax. And with the senators appointed corruptly by local businessmen, maybe we're getting some of that back again, but at least there were reforms. So it's certainly possible to do that, but predicting it in the current maelstrom is sort of a fool's errand.
Well, perhaps that's a positive note on which to begin to draw this conversation to a close. And I suppose the one thing we've certainly learned over the last year here in the UK and across the world is the extraordinary capacity actually of governments to do things which were previously unimaginable. I mean, here in the UK, we've had the government paying the wages of millions, at some point, 8 or 9 million private sector workers. We've had enormous amounts of money spent on supporting the public services. We've had increases in welfare benefits that we've not seen in 50 years, and we've had big public pressure for more support for particularly poor children, and in terms of making sure they've got the kinds of meals that they need. So we've had an incredibly activist government over this period. And as you say, sometimes these crises, this concern about the inequality of power as much as anything else can drive big political change and can drive us in positive directions. Now, of course, there's nothing historically certain about any of that, and there are lots of reasons for being perhaps skeptical about the scope for that kind of change over the next few years. But I think it is part of our purpose to come back to where we started, doing the huge amount of work that you and we are doing on inequalities at the moment, to look at ways in which we can understand and then do something about some of the problems that we've been discussing. And if we started out on this journey before anyone had ever heard of COVID or this pandemic, and I think we've been more than justified in doing that by the consequences of what we've seen over the last year, and some of the opportunities as well as problems that are going to be brought up by that. So Angus Deaton, thanks so much for that. And hopefully we can have you on again in a year or so's time, when we hopefully have some more answers to some of these questions as we progress with our work.
Well, the rate at which the world is changing, you probably have to be on me every couple of weeks to catch up with the horrible new things or the good new things that have happened in America. But it is a very exciting time in the way you say that policy space, the ability, there's policies that can be considered are much wider than they were just a year ago. And that's got to be good. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking.
Well, thank you. And I think that was a promise to come on once every 2 weeks. So we'll we'll see you soon.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Brilliant. That was brilliant. Thanks ever so much. Thank you for listening. For all our latest work, please visit www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support our work, please consider becoming a supporter of the IFS for as little as just £5 a month. You can find a link with further information in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay well.